Welcome to the Educational Physics Podcast. I am your host, João Figueiredo. This is Season 3 of the Educational Physics Podcast. I hope to speak about many issues. I hope to speak to guests about many issues. And I hope that we together can discuss the future of education in an honest and open way. Please consider subscribing, sharing, liking, and commenting. Your support is much appreciated. Thank you. Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Educational Physics Podcast. First and foremost, some house cleaning. Last week I did not post an episode, and that's because of two things. One, I wasn't feeling too great, and two, I've been quite busy, so it was a bad combination of factors. Either way, we're back. And the last episode was on brain-based education. We started to discuss this idea which revolves around understanding or attempting to understand how learning works physiologically. How does the brain operate during the learning process? And then, of course, how should teachers, parents, and all kinds of informal educators should attempt to teach in a way that is beneficial to the creation of synapses, rather than creating an environment that blocks that neurological learning process. So today, I would like to address something that is quite special to me, and you will see why in a second. And it's got a lot to do with brain-based education. So that would be, how does one develop muscle memory? Muscle memory, how does it work? Okay, in my field of education, as you might know, I teach music. So in my field, muscle memory is a must-have. You're supposed to develop muscle memory for patterns, stickings, grooves, scales, chord positions, you name it. And then the question is, how does one develop muscle memory? What is muscle memory? How to practice in a way that is beneficial to your muscle memory development? And let's start from the basics, right? What's muscle memory? So first of all, let's talk about what it's not. It's not memory that is in your muscles, okay? Your muscles do not have memory per se. What they do have is the ability to communicate with the brain. And the brain has the ability to communicate with the muscles. So muscle memory is nothing but the result of regular and constant repetition, which allows the brain to create more efficient neural pathways that induce a movement or a sequence of movements. So in other words, if your hand, let's say, repeats the same movement over and over and over again, your brain will start to identify that as being something that you probably want to retain. And so it starts to send that information not to the prefrontal cortex, where most of our reasoning and thinking is, but instead our premotor cortex, which is more or less here. And so when that happens, and the best way to look at the way the brain selects where to send information is the notion of bandwidth. If you're consciously thinking about a pattern or a movement, then the part of your brain that is mainly operating, not only but mainly operating, is more of a conscious part. For example, the prefrontal cortex. Now, the issue with that is that you take up all that bandwidth, and that simply just eliminates the possibility for the prefrontal cortex to be dealing with other stuff. Now, when the brain identifies that pattern of movements that your hand is executing, that being on the piano if you're playing a scale, or on the drums if you're playing a groove, your brain then recognizes, hold on, he or she is just doing the same thing over and over again. Let's move that information to a different part of the brain. And so it starts to send the information into the premotor cortex, which just takes care exactly of that, motor functions, especially repetitive ones. That allows you, like I said earlier, to free up bandwidth in your prefrontal cortex, which means you can then think about other things whilst playing. Now, that could be a source for distraction, and we'll talk a little bit about that in a second, but it can also be the source for mastery, because then you can add the layer. So whilst the premotor cortex processes the repetitive motions, then the prefrontal cortex can take care of assessing the artistic quality of what you're doing. So the way it works, muscle memory, is fundamentally like that. Repetitive motion begins, brain identifies that to be a repetitive motion, sends it, starts to create synapses, which then connect neurons and creates pathways between the thought of a motion and the motion itself, that way reducing the amount of conscious effort required. So again, go back to the idea of bandwidth. There's many levels of muscle memory, right? You have gross muscle memory, which are fundamentally just these big, large movements, such as walking, right? That would be part of your gross muscle memory, which is why we can learn how to walk at a fairly young age. We can't really learn how to play the piano until we are 4 or 5 years old. That's because fine motor memory is much more complex. Usually, fine motor memory is also stored in the premotor cortex, but the challenge with fine motor memory is that it is often, first of all, very small or smaller movements. So that makes the information much more complex, because it's no longer just about moving the hand or even the arm. It becomes about moving the fingers, and then moving the fingers separately, moving just one finger a certain amount of times, etc., etc. So fine motor memory is much more complex. The number of synapses that need to be created in order to trigger that kind of muscle memory is much more sophisticated, which also means it takes longer to develop. Once again, though, once that muscle memory is ingrained, the reality is that you will be able to then, as you perform something, and that could be, I'm using music as an example, it could be anything, it could be golf, it could be basketball, all those movements become memorized as we repeat them over time. And then we can think about the quality of the movement. So the gross image of it, the low resolution image of it, becomes stored in the premotor cortex, and then you can think about how you can improve on it. And that's a fundamental tool that you must leverage, which is your ability to indeed reflect on how you're using those movements. So you reflect on the outcome. In the case of music, you think about sound and dynamics and artistic expression and intention, emotional input. But then the question is, now that we've addressed what muscle memory is not and what muscle memory is and how it's formed, let's talk about how to practice it, how to engage in practice that is conducive to muscle memory. The first thing I want to say, which is something that I say to all my students, is muscle memory does not care about right or wrong. Do not forget this. What does that mean? if you perform a movement incorrectly, your muscle memory will not be selective and think, well, that's not quite correct, so let's just not memorize that until he or she corrects that movement, and then we'll start absorbing the information. You'd be so lucky. Unfortunately, that's not what happens, right? Just think about the old expression, bad habits. That person has bad habits. I've got the bad habit of fill the blank. Well, there you have it. If your memory was waiting on you to correct those bad habits before memorizing them, you wouldn't have bad habits in the first place. And as you know, as we all know, forgetting bad habits is quite difficult. And that's because now you already have these synapses going back and forth and these neural pathways that have been developed. And then you realize, or someone makes you realize, that you've made a mistake. That's not necessarily correct. It's more like this, not like that. And now you need to unlearn and relearn. That can be quite difficult, quite stressful, right? It can lead to a lot of anxiety. So be very careful with the way you go about practicing repetitive motion, because muscle memory does not care whether you're doing it correctly or incorrectly. Whatever you repeat, it sticks. That's the mindset, okay? Whatever you repeat, it sticks. So with that in mind, I would say that the best ways to develop good muscle memory, not bad habits, is to do a couple of things. One, try to identify how you learn best. Meaning, if you're not much of a visual learner, don't try to watch someone over and over again, because most likely you'll find yourself sort of understanding what they're doing, but not quite to the level of detail that you'll need to then acquire the muscle memory to then replicate what they're doing. If you're more of a read-write learner, for example, your muscle memory will actually benefit from you taking notes and sort of dissecting verb or in writing what the motion is, the sequence of movements. And then you can sort of follow that recipe, if you will, and then you start to engage in the repetition, in the drills. I'll give you an example from my own personal life. Besides teaching music, I also practice jiu-jitsu. Now, I am not an authority on this. I'm terrible at it. But here's the thing. I've come to understand and validate how I learn best. And I've known for many years that I am a note taker. It really helps me formulate and understand the concepts that I'm trying to retain much more quickly. And in jiu-jitsu was no different. I was watching my coaches demonstrate the movements, and I would kind of get it, but I would forget certain steps. And then, of course, you find yourself in these positions that are just not good for you. And then I started to realize, I need to just follow the way I learn, which is by writing. I need to take notes. I need to list off the movements. And then as I'm practicing, I have that list that I can just look at. Or some people do really well with flow charts, right? And so I would say that's number one. Identify how you learn the best, okay? Number two, daily practice beats long practice anytime. In other words, if you practice every day something that you're trying to memorize for 15 minutes, that's way better than you practicing once a week for 2 hours. Even if it adds up to the same amount of time, the sporadic practice will have less effect and less positive, outcome to your muscle memory, to your ability to recall that movement, that pattern, whatever you're trying to learn, than if you do less practice but on a daily basis. That constant daily recalling of what you did the day before is what's going to allow you to exponentially push the boundaries, try to do the movement faster, or try to do the movement against more resistance. And so I would say, without the shadow of a doubt, daily practice beats long practice every day. Number 3, practice within the same variables. Don't be changing the variables all the time. I see that with my students when they're trying to learn something. They try within the time span of a minute, they try 5 different speeds, and they try to then put like more sounds in it. So they're throwing themselves off because they're just zigzagging and changing the variables all the time. Not ideal at the start of the learning process. It really will cause a lot of confusion to the brain, because the brain is trying to understand, okay, which motion does he want to practice or to memorize even. And for the brain, believe it or not, if you perform a motion that's not yet fully memorized, so it's not lodged in your premotor cortex, then you change the speed, that's a different motion for the brain, right? And that's just the way it is, because actually the brain is not all that wrong. Different muscles will fire if you're trying to go faster. You'll have more tension, probably more muscles are engaging, most likely unnecessarily. And so the brain is not all that wrong, and that's actually a different pattern of movements. So stick to the same variables, at least for the start, until you find yourself comfortable with that movement at a certain speed. Then you can speed it up and challenge yourself to incrementally push the envelope. Now, on the flip side of that, number 4 is that you should change the variables. Now, let me say this again. Only once you've memorized the pattern within those constraints of same variables, same speed, same movement, same everything. Once you feel comfortable with that, you don't have to necessarily just increase the speed. Then you can, for example, change the where you play the pattern. You can change the octave. You can there's a million things you can do. You can add, if you're playing the piano, let's say, you can add the left hand and play a bass line over it. Lots of things that you can do. But do then challenge yourself to change the variables, because it will force your brain to understand how to transfer information that's now already understood. So the pattern has been memorized, and now you're forcing your brain to move that information to different places, right? That's only going to strengthen those synapses. So do that as soon as you're comfortable. Finally, number 5. I believe it's number 5. This is the way I also teach my students, right? You want to develop more neural pathways, right? Because what you want is for your brain to have multiple points of entry, so you can access the information when you need it as quickly as possible. So if we only have one way to go about it, you're going to have one way to access it. But if you have in your repertoire many different ways of accessing that information, then trust me, when you need it, your muscle memory will fire quickly. Because if one way is not available, another way will become immediately available. That's just what the brain does. It fires off synapses all the time. So it's not going to just freeze. And if you freeze, it's because you've ran out of ways to access the information. Try to understand what made you freeze, address that, create those neural pathways, and bam, you have now another way to access the same information. So the way I approach this is we use this sort of pyramid, sort of logic to it, to the learning process, that is. First level, understand. You have to understand what you're about to do, okay? Don't just try to wing it, because let's be fair, if your limbs don't know what to do, they won't learn it on the fly, okay? It's going to take time. Use more than just one sense. If you're playing music, don't just use your ears to tell you if you're hitting the right notes, because if you're trying to work on technique use more than just your ears. Use your eyes, right? And once again, that's going to create more neural pathways because you're using different parts of your brain to trigger all those different senses, right? The part of your brain that takes care of what it sounds like is not the same one or the same part that assesses what it looks like, okay? So first, understand the motion, understand what it should look like, understand what kind of sound it should produce, understand what kind of how it should feel in your body, etc., and of course understand the motion, the steps. Second level would be practice. So this is when you start drilling. Once again, same variables and only then different variables. Don't start to zigzag your way through it because it's a recipe for disaster. Bad habits. Be very careful. And finally, apply. So once again, this is a change of variables. But once you've understood that pattern, what I do with my students is, okay, let's apply this. So now we're going to have broader context. I'll give you my example, right? But I can also use jiu-jitsu for this. But in music, the application phase is fundamentally, let's play a song and let's use this new piece of information that we've been drilling in the song. Now, it doesn't have to be always. Sometimes it is. But it can be more sporadic. So we can start actually to also work on making the musical decisions in this case, right? So if I teach a student a drum fill, and then we make a point that, okay, let's play the song. You're going to play a groove. And then at the end of every 4 bars, you're going to play that drum fill. So you're going to have to recall now that information, not just from a repetitive perspective, but from actually playing something different. And then you have to recall and insert that drum fill into that broader context. In Jiu-Jitsu, it's the same thing, right? You learn your movement, you're learning how to do an armbar, let's say, and then at the end of a class, you do what it's called specific training, where you try to apply this stuff. You go on the floor with a partner and you roll, but you're rolling at a higher level of intensity, but it's not exactly sparring yet. So you still have room to apply the information you learned. And then eventually, of course, you go into live training and you just kick ass. Hopefully, if you've understood what you're supposed to be doing. But that's today's episode on muscle memory. I want to keep it nice and short because I would like you guys to apply this stuff rather than hear me babble on it. As always, it is my pleasure to speak to you all. If you like this, like, subscribe, comment, share, you know the spiel. Hopefully next week we're going to talk about how to develop other skills using brain-based education at the core of this. But in the meantime, go out there, have fun, and take care. Bye-bye.